Okay, it's time for Wild Rescuers Chapter 8. The sun was just beginning to peek through the mega spruce trees that surrounded their cave as Stacy set out the next morning. Stacy had told the wolf she was going to meet Addison as the wolf was coming off her patrol duty. But that was another lie. She was going to the forest of perpetual darkness to look for the helicopter. If her wolves were hiding something from her, she wanted to know what it was. Without a wolf to ride, it took Stacy several hours to make her way back to the spot where they had taken the photos. The sun was directly overhead as Stacy entered the dark forest. She knew Addison would be back by now, and the wolves would have discovered she and Addison had never met up. They might be looking for her right now, but she kept going. This felt like her only chance to find out the truth. Finally, Stacy pushed her way through the last tangle of brush and saw the wreckage in front of her. It looked like the skeleton of a helicopter. There had been a fire. The metal of the helicopter and the branches around it were charred and black. The glass was gone from the windows. She moved closer, examining it. The helicopter must have fallen through the trees, she realized. There were broken branches and felled trees beneath it, but it had been there long enough that more trees and bushes had grown over and around it. The front of the helicopter was crushed and blackened, but the back was almost whole. Stacy stepped up on a fallen log and peered in. Fire had destroyed the front seat, she saw at a glance. There were a few white bones among the ashes, and Stacy felt sick at the sight. Humans had died here. The back seat was still intact. There were the remains of a brightly colored book there, its pages pulpy and unreadable from the rains that had fallen since the helicopter had crashed. Beside it was a half-destroyed, moldy shape that Stacy recognized as a stuffed animal. A lamb, she thought, and she reached out a hand to touch it, leaning against the side of the helicopter. There was an alarming creak, and the helicopter shifted. Stacy stepped back. There was something familiar about the stuffed lamb, just like there was something familiar about the bracelet that Everest had brought her without wanting to tell her where it came from. Can you guys figure out what's happening? This is how I came to the forest, Stacy realized. She was sure of it. She looked again at the charred and crushed front of the helicopter. No one could have survived in there. My parents are dead. Stacy heard a branch break and spun around to see Basil, Everest, and Tucker. Is this where you found me? Stacy said, her eyes welling up with tears. Everest nodded solemnly while Basil hung her head. Tucker ran to Stacy and she threw her arms around him and sobbed into his chest. Stacy cried for a long time, her face buried in Tucker's thick white fur. He made soft, comforting noises, licking the top of her head, while Basil and Everest pressed their cool noses against her cheeks. At last she stopped crying. Her eyes felt sore and itchy, and she was dragging in long, harsh breaths. While she cried, hot anger had been rising inside her. Her pack had known where she had come from, and they had tried to keep her away from the place where they found her. They had known that her parents were dead. She sat back on her heels, pushing away from Tucker's chest. Then she got to her feet without looking at any of her wolves. They tried to stand close beside her, but she turned away. You should have shown me this sooner, Stacy said, brushing past Everest so that she was ahead of the wolves. If Stacy had looked into Everest's eyes, she would have been met with a sorrowful expression that said, I know. But she trudged past him and set off down the hill. They walked in silence all the way back to the cave. That's the end of that chapter, but that was short, so I'm going to read chapter 9 as well. Back at the cave, Stacy walked right past Addison and Noah and took a seat in her rocking chair. She stayed there for the rest of the night. It was the first time she could ever remember not sleeping next to the wolves, as sleep did not come easy. Stacy might have blamed it on the hard wooden rocking chair. It was difficult to find a comfortable sleeping position, but she was also cycling through a whole range of emotions that kept her from falling asleep. She felt betrayed by her wolves and angry with Everest. But she was also relieved to finally know how she had wound up lost in the taiga and happy to know there was no one looking for her who would take her away from her wolf family. The wolf family that didn't tell me the truth, she thought, feeling furious at them all over again. She shifted in the chair and wiped one hand across her wet eyes. Most of all, Stacy was sad that her parents were dead. She hadn't been abandoned in the woods, hadn't wandered away from an absent-minded mom and dad. Her parents had loved her. This both comforted Stacy and saddened her. She would never know them. Stacy cradled the small charm bracelet in her hand and pulled her arms into her shirt to stay warm. Paige stretched out on her lap for the night, and Wink curled up at her feet, his brown, warm eyes looking up at her anxiously. Stacy knew she could never stay mad at Wink, and besides, he had been only a pup when Stacy had come to live with the wolves. He had been as clueless as Stacy about her origins. Morning eventually came, and Stacy pried herself out of the sturdy rocking chair. She didn't speak to the wolves like she normally would. Instead, she silently fixed herself something to eat from the pantry and returned to her chair. Addison nudged her with a peace offering, a slice of pumpkin bread, but Stacy didn't even look up from the book she was reading. After a moment, Addison put the pumpkin bread beside her and walked away, her tail drooping sadly. Stacy bit her lip. Ignoring Addison was the cruelest thing she'd ever done to her. It wasn't that Stacy wanted to give the wolves the silent treatment, but she honestly didn't know what to say to them. Deep down, she knew the wolves had only meant well, but it still felt like a betrayal. So she kept quiet, afraid of saying something she might regret. Usually at about this time, Stacy would be choosing a wolf to accompany her on whatever outing she had planned for that day, but she didn't feel like going anywhere. So Stacy lost herself in a book instead, and didn't even look up as Noah, Everest, and Basil set out to visit Droplet and Splat. Several hours passed, and Stacy stayed completely immersed in her book. It was a long one, Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Stacy had just reached the halfway point when Milo the bat swooped into the cave at breakneck speed. Paige jumped off Stacy's lap and ran out of the cave with all the wolves on her heels. Stacy quickly dog-eared the page of her book she was reading. There was no time to find a bookmark, and hurried after everyone else. She knew it must be an emergency rescue. Usually, they would take the time to at least look at the map before leaving the cave so that Paige could show them where they were headed. Stacy ran out of the cave into the clearing and gasped, "Noah!" Propped up against Everest was a very unsteady Noah. He took a wobbly step forward and then collapsed onto the ground. His eyes closed, and Stacy couldn't tell if he was still breathing. "What happened to him?" Stacy yelled at Everest, breaking her silence as the alpha ran into the cave. And then she saw it. Sticking out of Noah's shoulder was a small dart. Did they poison him? Stacy's heart was pounding with panic. What if the villagers have found my wolves before we've had a chance to make up? She didn't want anything to happen to Noah, especially not while he thought she was angry with him. Stacy lunged toward the dart and pulled it from Noah's shoulder blade. She quickly ran her hands through his fur, filling his sides, and then exhaled in relief. He was breathing. It must have been a tranquilizer dart, Stacy thought. Noah was unconscious, not dead. But who shot him with that dart? "Basil, set up a perimeter," Stacy said in an urgent, hushed voice. Basil hurried away and disappeared into the trees, off to make sure no one was closing in on their location. Everest returned from the cave with an old ripped tarp they had found discarded at the campground. Do you see the dart in Noah? "Good," Stacy said, taking the tarp and spreading it out on the ground. Everest, Tucker, and Addison rolled Noah, who was fast asleep, onto the tarp, and each took a corner of it in their mouths. Stacy grabbed tight to the last corner. Together they pulled Noah into the cave, while Wink covered up their tracks behind them. Once inside, they positioned Noah in front of the hearth. Wink attempted in vain to rouse him with his nose, while Tucker checked Noah for more darts. Everest was at the cave's entrance, waiting for Basil to return. Stacy looked up to see Addison already at the bookcase, nosing through some medical texts. "I assume he'll come in a few hours, Addie." "Come to in a few hours, Addie," Stacy said, placing the dart down on the desk. She began to thumb through the books, looking for anything about sedation. "We'll keep his mouth open and get some fresh water for when he wakes up, but that's about all we can do." Suddenly, Everest was beside Stacy, his massive body leaning over her, pressing his nose to her lips to stop her from talking. Stacy quieted, and then she heard it. Human voices coming from outside the cave. "No sign of the male, Dr. Berg," a young woman's voice called out. Stacy froze. The voices were very close. She had pulled the branch trapdoor across the cave entrance, but would it disguise the opening well enough? What if the humans had shot Noah with a tracking dart? Paige's ears pricked up in interest at the voices. Silently, Stacy slid a hand over her muzzle, hoping the little dog would stay quiet. Holding her breath, Stacy looked around at her pack. They were all still but silent, their attention fixed on the voices outside the cave. "He could have run into a cave or behind some boulders," a deeper voice said. "Look carefully for white fur." Stacy stiffened. What would she and the wolves do if the cave was found? The noise from the footsteps grew louder outside as the humans searched. Finally, the young woman said, "I think he ran farther. He was heading northwest." The male voice said sharply, "Did you see that?" Pounding footsteps began as if the humans had broken into a run. In a few moments, the sound of their footsteps had faded. Stacy let out a shaky breath, relieved. The researchers were probably being led away by Basil. As much as Basil's newfound speed confused Stacy, she was thankful for it in this moment. A dozen wolf researchers could try to land a shot on Basil, and they'd all miss, she thought. The wolves took turns lying near Noah all evening, including Basil, who had successfully eluded the researchers and returned to the cave. Stacy never left Noah's side. She wondered how it was possible that just this morning she had been angry with these magnificent creatures she was lucky enough to call family. She ran a hand over the messy tuft of fur between Noah's ears. What if I'd lost him? The wolves hadn't told her the truth, but they had protected her and loved her since her first rescue day. She understood they hadn't wanted to hurt her by showing her something so horrible, something she had forgotten. The helicopter crash was tragic, but it is in the past, Stacy thought. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment. It still hurt. Her human family was dead, and she had forgotten them. Someday I'll learn more about them, she promised herself, but right now the only family she knew was right here in the cave with her, and they needed protecting. Ordinarily, Stacy would have been thrilled to see conservationists in the taiga. It was definitely the type of work she'd want to be doing if she didn't really have a job rescuing animals. The fact that the research team was searching the forest could mean they were one step closer to getting the forest designated as protected land, but having them tranquilize one of her wolves was a step too far. How can I protect them from an entire team of researchers who are out here looking for glimpses of white fur? "Snow," Stacy said quietly under her breath. Addison's ears perked up, and she lifted her head to look at Stacy. "It's not safe for you here until it snows," Stacy continued, looking around the cave at the others. "You stand out too much. That's why they were able to shoot Noah. Wolves like Droplet and Splat, their markings are suited to the dark foliage of the taiga forest. Addison's got a tinge of brown in her coat that helps a bit, but for the most part, you're all as white as snow." Stacy stood up to address the group. They were all looking at her now, their ears pricked in interest. "If today has taught me anything, it's that I need to do whatever it takes to not lose any more of my family. I'm sorry I reacted badly, and I'm sorry for the lies I've told these last few weeks. No more lies, no more leaving without telling you where I'm going, and no more close calls." Stacy took a deep breath and steadied herself for the reaction she knew would come for the next sentence. "I think we should leave the taiga and return only after the first snowfall." The wolves sat in stunned silence. Stacy took this as a good sign. At least they seemed open to the idea. She knew the stress of the wolf bounty and Wink's photo in the paper had been weighing on them. She continued. "We'd only be gone for a few months," Stacy said. "Think of it like a vacation. We could bring Milo too and do rescues wherever we go. A proper rescue expedition. By the time we're back, there will be plenty of snow to camouflage all of you, and we won't have to worry so much about being seen until it thaws in the spring. It's perfect." Stacy looked at each of her wolves. Everest, Wink, Addison, Tucker, and Basil stared back at her, all with similar unsure expressions. Suddenly, an enthusiastic bark rang out from behind Stacy. She spun around to see Noah awake and standing. Everyone ran to Noah, Tucker and Basil nuzzling him, while Paige rubbed her head against one of his legs, looking at him adoringly. "That settles it then," Stacy said with a smile. "We'll leave tomorrow."